Rebecca Lynn O'Donnell. On June 4, 2019, former Arkansas State Senator Linda Collins was found deceased and decomposing under a tarp outside her Pocahontas home. Her best friend and former campaign manager, Rebecca Lynn O'Donnell, had stabbed her multiple times in what would become one of Arkansas's most shocking betrayals. O'Donnell, born around 1971, had grown up in the Pocahontas area and developed a close friendship with Collins that extended beyond political work. She served as Collins' campaign manager and confidant, making the subsequent events all the more devastating to those who knew both women. What led to the confrontation? O'Donnell had been embezzling money from Collins, a fact that Collins discovered and confronted her about. The financial betrayal set the stage for a deadly encounter when Collins demanded accountability for the stolen funds. On that June day, O'Donnell arrived at Collins' residence armed with a knife. During the confrontation about the embezzlement, O'Donnell stabbed Collins numerous times, ending her life in a sustained attack that reflected both rage and intent to silence the former senator permanently. After ending Collins' life, O'Donnell wrapped the body in a tarp and left it outside the home, where it remained for days before discovery. The decomposition made initial identification difficult and added to the trauma for Collins' family and investigators. How was she caught? Security camera footage proved crucial in identifying O'Donnell, showing her carrying what appeared to be a bloody knife. Investigators also gathered forensic evidence from the crime scene that linked her to the attack, building a case that would prove overwhelming. O'Donnell was arrested and charged with first-degree ending, tampering with physical evidence, and other related crimes. As she sat in jail awaiting trial, her behavior revealed the depths of her criminality beyond the initial offense. What did she do while incarcerated? While in custody, O'Donnell solicited other inmates to harm witnesses in her case, attempting to obstruct justice and eliminate those who could testify against her. These solicitation charges were added to her existing legal troubles, demonstrating continued criminal intent, even behind bars. On July 31, 2020, Rebecca Lynn O'Donnell pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and other charges in the death of former state senator Linda Collins. During her plea, she stated, "I intentionally killed her," finally accepting responsibility for the brutal ending of her former friend. O'Donnell was sentenced to 50 years in prison, with the requirement that she serve at least 70% of her sentence for the murder charge before becoming eligible for parole, rather than being completely ineligible until age 99. How did Collins' family respond? Collins' ex-husband Phil Smith spoke after sentencing, stating, "My family and I are grateful that justice has been done." He requested privacy for the family and that Linda be allowed to rest in peace, emphasizing the need to move forward after years of trauma. Collins had served in the Arkansas House of Representatives from 2015 to 2019, building a reputation as a dedicated public servant before her retirement from politics. Her constituents remembered her commitment to Arkansas issues and her approachable nature. The betrayal by someone so close shocked the political community and the broader public. Friends described Collins as trusting and generous, qualities that made her vulnerable to O'Donnell's deception and ultimately contributed to her tragic ending. O'Donnell's motive remained financial at its core, with the embezzlement confrontation triggering the violence. The progression from theft to ending life demonstrated how financial crimes can escalate when perpetrators face accountability. As of 2026, O'Donnell remains incarcerated in the Arkansas prison system, serving her lengthy sentence with no realistic possibility of release. The case continues to be referenced in discussions about trust, betrayal, and the vulnerability of public figures. The tragedy highlighted how those closest to victims often pose the greatest danger, with familiarity providing both opportunity and means. Collins' trust in her friend and campaign manager created the access that O'Donnell exploited fatally. Security footage and forensic evidence demonstrated how modern investigative tools can quickly identify perpetrators even when they attempt to cover their crimes. Without the camera evidence, the investigation might have taken considerably longer to connect O'Donnell to the scene. Sometimes financial crimes serve as prelude to more serious offenses, but other cases begin with deeply troubled psychological states. Christina Marie Riggs. On November 4, 1997, licensed practical nurse Christina Marie Riggs ended the lives of her 2 young children in Sherwood, Arkansas. She sedated them with the antidepressant Elavil before smothering them in what she later described as an act she believed would end their suffering along with hers. Riggs, born September 2, 1971 in Lawton, Oklahoma, endured severe trauma throughout her childhood. From ages 7 to 13, she suffered harm from her stepbrother, followed by similar treatment from a neighbor. These experiences left deep psychological scars that would affect her entire life. By age 14, Riggs had begun using substances including drinks, cigarettes, and marijuana as she attempted to cope with her trauma. An early pregnancy led to her first child, whom she placed for adoption in 1988 while still a teenager. In 1993, Riggs married sailor John Riggs and had 2 children together. However, the marriage was troubled, with John reportedly causing harm within the family and contributing to the household's financial difficulties. The couple divorced, leaving Christina as a single mother struggling with debt and depression. What happened on November 4, 1997? That evening, Riggs gave her children Elavil to sedate them, planning to end all their lives together. She then attempted to inject one child with potassium chloride she had obtained from her workplace, but the chemical caused pain and the child awoke screaming. Unable to complete the injection, Riggs smothered the child with a pillow. She then smothered her other child in the same manner. After ending both their lives, she attempted to take her own life by consuming 28 Elavil tablets and injecting herself with potassium chloride. The self-injection burned her arm tissue rather than entering her bloodstream properly, preventing the chemical from being lethal despite the massive dose. This failure meant Riggs survived her attempt, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions. How was she discovered? Riggs's mother, Carol Thomas, found her unconscious the next day when Christina failed to appear for work. Emergency services rushed Riggs to the hospital while discovering the children had already passed. She was arrested on November 6, 1997, after medical treatment stabilized her condition. What happened at trial? Her trial in Pulaski County Circuit Court began in June 1998. Psychiatrists testified extensively about Riggs's severe depression, explaining how her mental state had been shaped by childhood trauma, substance history, financial stress, and the difficult divorce from a harmful spouse. The psychiatric experts explained that Riggs' depression had impaired her judgment so severely she could not appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions. They presented her history of trauma and mental illness as context for understanding her deteriorated mental state. Despite initially entering an insanity plea, Riggs waived a competency hearing and did not mount a strong defense during the penalty phase. She expressed to the court that she wanted the death penalty rather than life in prison. After just 55 minutes of deliberation, the jury of 7 women and 5 men found her guilty on June 30, 1998, recommending execution. Judge Marion Humphrey set the original execution date for August 15, 1998, but it was stayed several times during the mandatory appeals process before her eventual execution in 2000. The Arkansas Supreme Court upheld her sentence in a 6-1 decision. After a mental evaluation confirmed her competency to waive further appeals, Riggs chose not to pursue additional legal challenges, accepting her fate. What were her final words? On May 2, 2000, Riggs was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit in Pine Bluff, becoming the first woman executed in Arkansas since 1845. She was pronounced deceased at 9:28 p.m. Her final statement included, "There is no way words can express just how sorry I am for taking the lives of my babies. No way I can make up for or take away the pain I have caused everyone who knew and loved them. Her last whispered words were, "I love you, my babies." What impact did this case have? The case sparked extensive discussions about maternal mental health and the intersection of severe depression with capital punishment. Advocates pointed to Riggs's case as evidence that mental health support for struggling mothers needed significant improvement. The debate over executing women with documented mental illness intensified, with many questioning whether the death penalty was appropriate for someone whose actions stemmed from treatable psychiatric conditions. Riggs's documented history of trauma and depression became central to these discussions. Mental health professionals used the case to highlight how untreated depression, especially when combined with trauma history and life stressors, can lead to tragic outcomes. They emphasized the importance of accessible mental health care for mothers experiencing postpartum issues or other depressive episodes. The case also raised questions about how the justice system handles defendants who actively seek execution rather than fighting for their lives. Riggs's desire for the death penalty complicated the traditional adversarial nature of capital trials. Family support systems and their role in preventing tragedies also came under scrutiny. Despite having family members aware of her struggles, Riggs had fallen through gaps in informal support networks and formal mental health systems. While this case involved severe mental illness, another would stem from a very different set of circumstances. Deja Rollins. In July 2024, Deja Rollins and her husband Justin were arrested after a horrific discovery at Arkansas Children's Hospital. While seeking treatment for one of their children, hospital staff discovered that multiple children in their care had suffered from severe neglect with fatal consequences. The couple's young child had passed away from malnutrition while under their care, a tragedy that alone would have warranted serious charges. However, investigators would soon uncover an even more disturbing pattern. What did investigators discover? While the Rollins were at the hospital with one child, they had left 4 other children ages 2 to 10 alone in a hot vehicle. The Jacksonville, Arkansas couple had apparently considered this acceptable while they attended to medical matters inside the facility. The 2-year-old in the vehicle passed away from heat exhaustion as temperatures inside the car became deadly. The other children in the vehicle survived, but showed signs of distress and dehydration when discovered. Medical examination of the surviving children revealed extensive evidence of long-term neglect. One child bore visible marks indicating ongoing physical harm. The pattern suggested systemic failures in the household rather than isolated incidents. How did authorities respond? Pulaski County Prosecuting Attorney Will Jones described the case as one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking cases our office has ever encountered. He emphasized that protecting children is the top priority for the prosecutor's office and law enforcement. The Rollins were charged with 2 counts of second-degree ending and 1 count of first-degree domestic battery. The charges reflected both the deaths that occurred and the ongoing pattern of harm to the surviving child. Rather than proceed to trial, both defendants entered guilty pleas to all charges against them. The decision to plead guilty may have reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against them. In April 2025, both Deja and Justin Rollins were sentenced to 70 years in prison. The lengthy sentences reflected the severity of the crimes and the loss of 2 young lives due to parental neglect. The sentence structure combined the multiple charges into a total punishment designed to keep both defendants incarcerated for the majority of their remaining lives. Neither defendant received consideration for parole eligibility in the immediate future. What systemic failures were highlighted? The case raised serious questions about child welfare oversight in Arkansas. How had such severe neglect continued without intervention from schools, medical providers, or neighbors who might have noticed warning signs? The deaths occurred despite the existence of mandatory reporting laws that require professionals who work with children to report suspected neglect or harm. The failure to identify and intervene in this family's situation before the fatal outcomes represented a breakdown in protective systems. Community members expressed shock that such severe neglect could occur without detection. The Jacksonville neighborhood, where the family lived, appeared outwardly normal, with nothing obvious to alert outsiders to the crisis within the home. What about the surviving children? The children who survived were removed from the home and placed in protective custody. Their long-term care arrangements and the extent of services needed to address their trauma remained matters handled through family services rather than public proceedings. Medical professionals who examined the surviving children noted that recovery from such severe neglect would require extensive physical and psychological support. The developmental delays and trauma would necessitate ongoing care for years. As of 2026, both Deja and Justin Rollins remain incarcerated in the Arkansas Department of Corrections, serving their 70-year sentences. The case continues to be cited in discussions about improving child welfare systems and identifying at-risk families before tragedies occur. The multiple failures that allowed the neglect to reach fatal levels highlighted the need for better coordination between medical providers, schools, and social services. No single institution had a complete picture of the family's situation until it was too late. While this case involved long-term neglect, another would demonstrate how quickly a moment of frustration could turn deadly. Aaron Sauls. On December 30th, 2025, 23-year-old Aaron Sauls was operating an unlicensed home daycare in Little Rock when tragedy struck. During what should have been a routine diaper change, Sauls became frustrated with 8-month-old Elijah Flowerday and committed an act that would end his life. Sauls had been operating the daycare out of her home for several months, caring for multiple children without proper licensing or oversight from state authorities. Parents in the neighborhood had utilized her services, unaware that she lacked the credentials and training typically required for childcare providers. What happened during the incident? While changing Elijah's diaper, Sauls later confessed that she was frustrated and had a headache. In a moment of rage, she slammed the infant's head into the hardwood floor 3 times with enough force to cause catastrophic injuries. The impacts caused a skull fracture and severe brain bleeding that left Elijah unresponsive. Sauls called emergency services, but the baby's injuries proved too severe for medical intervention to save his life. Elijah was rushed to a hospital where doctors worked to stabilize him, but the extent of the brain damage made survival impossible. He passed away from his injuries, prompting a criminal investigation into the circumstances of his passing. How did the investigation unfold? Medical staff recognized that Elijah's injuries were inconsistent with accidental causes. The pattern and severity of the skull fracture and brain bleeding indicated deliberate trauma rather than a fall or other accident. When questioned by police, Sauls confessed to her actions, admitting that she had intentionally struck the baby's head against the floor multiple times. Her confession provided investigators with the evidence needed to pursue serious charges. Forensic examination confirmed the autopsy findings, showing that the skull fracture and internal bleeding were consistent with the forceful impacts Sauls described. The medical evidence left no doubt about the cause and manner of the infant's passing. What charges was she facing? Sauls was charged with capital punishment level ending under Arkansas law. The charge reflected the deliberate nature of her actions and the vulnerability of the victim. On December 31st, 2025, Sauls was arraigned and entered a plea of not guilty despite her earlier confession to police. The not guilty plea set the stage for a trial where prosecutors would present the evidence against her. She was held without bond at the Pulaski County Jail as she awaited further court proceedings. The judge determined that the severity of the charges and the confession warranted keeping her in custody without the option of posting bail. As of January 2026, Sauls has a court date scheduled for February 27, 2026, where the case will proceed through the legal system. The trial will likely examine her mental state, the circumstances of the daycare operation, and the events leading to Elijah's passing. How did the community react? Parents who had used Saul's daycare services expressed shock and devastation upon learning of the charges. Many had trusted her with their children's care, unaware of the dangers present in the unlicensed facility. The case raised urgent questions about unlicensed childcare operations and how parents can verify the credentials and backgrounds of caregivers. Licensed facilities undergo inspections and require staff training that unlicensed operations do not. Elijah's family was left to grieve the loss of their infant, while grappling with the knowledge that his passing resulted from a moment of rage by someone they had trusted. The preventable nature of the tragedy compounded their suffering. The incident highlighted the critical importance of proper licensing, background checks, and training for anyone providing childcare services. Frustration and headaches are common human experiences, but professionals caring for vulnerable infants must have the training and temperament to handle such moments without harming children. The investigation into Saul's background and the operation of her unlicensed daycare continues as prosecutors build their case for trial. The outcome will determine whether she spends the rest of her life in prison for taking Elijah's life in a moment of deadly frustration. Sometimes deadly moments stem from frustration, while other cases involve long simmering relationship conflicts. Melissa Gailey. In November 2018, Melissa Gailey committed a horrific double ending at her Hot Springs home, targeting her own mother and daughter. Gailey, then 46 years old, stabbed both 71-year-old Wanda Self and 8-year-old Megan Gailey, taking their lives in a planned attack. After the stabbings, Gailey attempted to set the residence on fire by igniting the area underneath the home. The arson attempt appeared designed to destroy evidence of the crimes and possibly claim the deaths resulted from an accidental fire. How was she discovered? Police found Gailey covered in blood after she emerged from underneath the home where she had been attempting to start the fire. Her appearance and location immediately raised suspicions about her involvement in whatever had occurred inside the residence. When questioned by investigators, Gailey confessed to the attacks. She admitted that she had planned the acts for approximately 1 week before carrying them out, revealing the premeditated nature of her actions. What was her motive? Despite her confession and admission of planning, Gailey provided no clear explanation for why she targeted her mother and daughter. The lack of an articulated motive left investigators, prosecutors, and the community struggling to understand what could drive someone to such acts against family members. The week-long planning period indicated that this was not an impulsive act committed in a moment of rage or mental breakdown. Gailey had time to consider her actions, yet she proceeded with the plan to end both lives. Forensic examination confirmed the stab wounds as the cause of passing for both victims. The medical evidence supported Gailey's confession about the method used in the attacks. Fire investigators documented the attempted arson underneath the home, providing evidence for the additional charge of attempted arson. The fire had not progressed significantly before Gailey's discovery prevented further damage. What were the legal proceedings? Gailey was arrested on 2 counts of capital-level ending and 1 count of attempted arson. She was held without bond at the Garland County Jail as the case moved through the judicial system. In November 2019, approximately 1 year after the crimes, Gailey entered guilty pleas to the charges against her. The decision to plead guilty rather than proceed to trial meant the case would move directly to sentencing. The court sentenced Gailey to 2 consecutive life terms in prison, ensuring she would spend the remainder of her life behind bars. The consecutive nature of the sentences meant she could not earn early release or parole. How did the community react? The Hot Springs community expressed shock at the familial nature of the crimes. The killing of both a parent and child by the same family member in a planned attack was particularly disturbing to those who learned of the case. The absence of a clear motive made the case even more difficult for community members to process. People often seek to understand why such tragedies occur, but Gailey's silence on her reasoning left that question unanswered. Family members and friends of the victims struggled with the dual loss of two generations. Wanda Self's life experiences and Megan's potential future were both stolen in a single violent episode. Limited public statements were made by involved parties beyond the basic facts of the case. The family's grief remained largely private as they attempted to cope with the incomprehensible loss. As of 2026, Gailey remains incarcerated in the Arkansas prison system, serving her 2 life sentences. With no possibility of parole, she will spend the rest of her natural life in prison for the planned ending of her mother and daughter. The case stands as one of the more mysterious in Arkansas criminal history due to the complete absence of an explained motive. Mental health evaluations and psychological assessments conducted around the time of her guilty plea were not made public, leaving questions about her mental state unanswered. The premeditated nature of the crimes, combined with the attempt to destroy evidence through arson, suggested calculated thinking rather than an episode of psychosis or severe mental break. Yet the targeting of close family members without clear reason defies typical patterns in such cases. The investigation file remains closed with Gailey's guilty pleas, but the unanswered questions about motivation ensure the case continues to puzzle those who study criminal behavior. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. While Gailey's motives remained unclear, another case would involve a relationship conflict that escalated fatally. Latoshia Daniels. On April 4, 2019, Latoshia Daniels drove 3 hours from Little Rock, Arkansas to Collierville, Tennessee with a loaded 9mm Ruger pistol. She entered the apartment of Memphis pastor Broads Perry and shot him, ending his life. She also shot and injured his wife, Tabitha Perry Archie, before fleeing the scene. Daniels, born around 1979, had grown up in a troubled household marked by domestic difficulties. Her stepfather, who was a pastor, created an environment where family problems were hidden rather than addressed. This childhood experience with concealment and harm would influence her later relationships. What was her relationship with Perry? Daniels and Perry had been involved in a 2-year romantic relationship despite Perry being married. During trial testimony, Daniels stated she felt manipulated into the relationship and was devastated when Perry ended their involvement. Videos shown during court proceedings depicted Perry promoting concepts of ethical non-monogamy, suggesting his approach to relationships differed from traditional expectations. These videos became part of the evidence presented to the jury to help them understand the context of the affair. How did the shooting unfold? On that April day, Daniels made the decision to confront Perry at his home. She brought the firearm with her, indicating premeditation of potential harm. When she arrived at the Collierville apartment, she encountered both Perry and his wife. Daniels fired the weapon multiple times, striking Perry with fatal shots and hitting Tabitha with injuries that would require medical treatment, but were not lethal. The shooting occurred inside the residence, allowing little opportunity for the victims to escape or defend themselves. During testimony, Daniels admitted to firing the gun, but claimed she had no memory of actually pulling the trigger. This assertion of partial amnesia regarding the critical moment of the shooting became a key aspect of her defense. Daniels was arrested and initially charged with first-degree ending, attempted first-degree ending, and felony firearm use. The most serious charges carried the potential for life imprisonment without parole. Her trial in Shelby County, Tennessee, concluded in January 2023, with her sentencing occurring shortly thereafter, in March 2023. Psychiatric evaluations conducted for the case examined her childhood trauma and current mental health. The jury convicted Daniels of second-degree ending rather than first-degree, finding that while she knowingly ended Perry's life, the crime lacked the premeditation required for first-degree conviction. They also convicted her of reckless endangerment for the injuries to Tabitha. Interestingly, the jury acquitted Daniels on the firearm charge, a somewhat unusual outcome, given that she admitted to firing the weapon. The acquittal on this count may have reflected jury sympathy regarding her claims of manipulation. What about sentencing? Daniels faces 13.5 to 60 years for the second-degree ending conviction, with an additional potential sentence of up to 11 months for the reckless endangerment charge. The wide range in potential sentencing reflects the judge's discretion in weighing various factors. Originally scheduled for late 2025, the sentencing hearing was delayed due to paperwork issues with the mental health evaluation. These evaluations are crucial in determining appropriate sentencing, particularly when mental health and trauma play roles in the crime. Latoshia Daniels was sentenced in March 2023 to 20 years in prison for the second-degree murder of Brodess Perry and 21 years for the attempted murder of his wife, to be served concurrently. What is her current status? As of January 2026, Daniels remains held in a Tennessee jail awaiting her sentencing hearing. The delay has extended her time in custody without a final determination of her sentence. Daniels has expressed remorse for Perry's passing while maintaining that manipulation played a significant role in the relationship dynamics that led to the shooting. Her statements to the court emphasized her feelings of betrayal when the affair ended. The case highlighted complex dynamics of romantic relationships, manipulation, and how childhood trauma can make individuals vulnerable to unhealthy attachments. Mental health professionals who evaluated Daniels noted connections between her troubled upbringing and her responses to perceived rejection. Perry's congregation and family were left to grapple with revelations about his personal life that emerged during the trial. The public nature of the proceedings brought painful details into the open that might otherwise have remained private. While this case involved relationship betrayal, another would center on a seemingly trivial trigger with deadly consequences. Belinda Goff. Belinda Goff's case stands apart from others in Arkansas criminal history due to persistent claims of innocence supported by the Innocence Project. On June 11, 1994, her husband Stephen Goff was found bludgeoned in their Green Forest apartment, and Belinda would eventually be convicted, despite maintaining she had nothing to do with his passing. Born in 1962, Goff had grown up in Arkansas and built what appeared to be a stable family life. She and Stephen had 3 children together, and Belinda worked as a housekeeper to help support the household. What happened on June 11, 1994? Belinda returned home from her night shift job to discover Stephen had been harmed with blunt force. She immediately called authorities to report finding her husband in this condition. Police responded to investigate what appeared to be a homicide. Forensic examination revealed blunt force trauma as the cause, but no definitive weapon was identified despite investigators testing hammers from the home. Blood evidence did not match any of the tested items conclusively. Critically, police ignored investigative leads suggesting Stephen had been involved in an arson-for-hire scheme with Belinda's brother, Chris Lindley. According to these leads, Stephen had allegedly stolen money from participants in the scheme, providing potential motive for alternative suspects. How was the investigation handled? Key evidence, including a bloody hammer, vanished during the investigation, raising serious questions about evidence handling and chain of custody. DNA testing that might have identified the perpetrator was not initially pursued by investigators. Belinda was arrested nearly a year later in May 1995 on circumstantial evidence. The case against her relied heavily on a neighbor's claim of seeing her near the scene, though this witness later recanted the statement. Despite being offered a plea deal of 10 years, Goff refused, insisting on her innocence and declining to admit to something she maintained she did not do. She repeatedly stated, "I did not end my husband's life throughout the proceedings." In 1996, a Carroll County jury convicted Goff of first-degree ending and sentenced her to life in prison. The conviction came despite the significant evidentiary problems and ignored alternative suspects. Appeals through the standard court system failed to overturn her conviction, leaving Goff to serve her sentence while maintaining innocence. She would spend over 2 decades behind bars before new developments in her case. How did the Innocence Project get involved? In 2013, the Innocence Project took on Goff's case, recognizing the problematic nature of her conviction. They arranged for DNA testing of crime scene evidence that had never been properly analyzed during the original investigation. The DNA tests were inconclusive due to the age of the evidence and degradation. However, the lack of incriminating DNA and the recantation of a key witness were the primary drivers for her 2019 release. This exculpatory evidence became central to efforts to secure her release. Forensic experts reviewing the case suggested her conviction resulted from systemic failures rather than actual guilt. The ignored leads about the arson scheme, the missing evidence, and the lack of physical evidence connecting her to the crime all pointed to a miscarriage of justice. What led to her release? After serving 23 years and 9 months in prison, Goff was released in June 2019 via an Alford plea to manslaughter. This legal mechanism allowed her to maintain her innocence while acknowledging that sufficient evidence existed for a conviction. Circuit Judge Scott Jackson ruled that Goff would likely be acquitted in a retrial due to the evidentiary weaknesses that had become apparent. He sentenced her to time served plus a 10-year suspended sentence with no contact orders. The Innocence Project advocated strongly for clemency, noting the combination of ignored evidence, missing materials, and DNA results that failed to implicate Goff. They described her case as emblematic of how wrongful convictions occur through investigative failures. What has she said since release? In interviews following her release, Goff emphasized the importance of her family's support. She stated, "My children's visits kept me going through the long years of incarceration while fighting for exoneration." Goff has become an advocate for wrongful conviction reform, using her experience to highlight how innocent people can be swept up in the criminal justice system. She speaks about the importance of proper evidence handling and thorough investigation of all leads. As of 2026, Goff lives freely in Arkansas, having rebuilt her life after more than 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment. She continues her advocacy work and maintains contact with the Innocence Project. No new legal actions have been reported in her case, though questions about who actually ended Stephen Goff's life remain unanswered. The real perpetrator was never identified or prosecuted. The case serves as a stark reminder of how investigative failures, missing evidence, and tunnel vision in law enforcement can lead to convictions of innocent people. Goff's 23 years behind bars represent time that can never be recovered. While Goff was wrongly convicted, another case would involve clear evidence but an unusual triggering event. Patricia Hill. On July 14, 2018, Patricia Hill shot her husband Frank Hill in his backyard shed in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. The 69-year-old nurse and longtime churchgoer ended her husband's life over his repeated ordering of an adult entertainment channel on their Dish Network subscription. Hill, born around 1949, had worked as a nurse for 50 years and was known in her community as a dedicated church member and Sunday school teacher. She was in her 3rd marriage to Frank Hill, whom she had been with for some time. What triggered the shooting? Hill discovered that Frank had reordered an adult channel on their television service for the 2nd time, despite her previous cancellations of the subscription. This pattern of him reordering content she found objectionable had created ongoing tension in their marriage. On the day of the shooting, Hill confronted Frank in his shed, which he used as a personal retreat or man cave. The confrontation over the channel subscription escalated beyond a verbal argument. Hill later testified that she fired at Frank's feet initially, intending to get his attention during what she described as a dissociative episode. However, the gunfire proved fatal, striking him in a way that caused his passing. What did she say about her mental state? During testimony, Hill stated, "I wasn't thinking," and that she had snapped under the stress of their estranged relationship and his repeated disregard for her wishes about the adult content. She described feeling unheard and disrespected in the marriage. Hill's description of the shooting included claims that she experienced a mental break at the moment she fired the weapon. Her defense would later argue that this dissociative state should be considered in determining her culpability. Forensic examination confirmed the gunshot wound to Frank's head as the cause of his passing. The medical evidence supported that the shooting occurred during the confrontation in the shed. What were the legal proceedings? Hill was arrested and initially charged with capital-level ending, facing the possibility of life in prison without parole. The severity of the charge reflected the intentional use of a firearm resulting in someone's passing. Her trial in Jefferson County Circuit Court began in April 2019. Defense attorneys presented evidence of her clean record over 69 years of life, her decades of service as a nurse, and her mental health struggles in the marriage. The defense argued that Hill's mental state at the time of the shooting should mitigate her responsibility. They emphasized her lack of prior criminal behavior and her contributions to the community through her nursing work and church involvement. The jury convicted Hill of second-degree ending rather than first-degree or capital, apparently accepting that while she intentionally fired the weapon, the circumstances warranted a lesser conviction. The deliberations were relatively brief. What was her sentence? Prosecutors negotiated a sentence of 16 years in prison, with parole eligibility after serving approximately 3 years of the sentence. The negotiated outcome reflected considerations of her age, clean record, and mental health factors. Hill became eligible for parole consideration around 2022, though no public updates about whether she was granted parole have emerged in available records. At her age, even a few years in prison represents a significant portion of remaining life. How did family respond? Hill's daughter described her mother as loving and caring, expressing shock that the situation had escalated to such tragedy. The daughter's statement suggested the shooting was completely out of character for the woman she knew. Family members struggled to reconcile the grandmother and church lady they knew with the person who had ended Frank's life over a cable television dispute. The seemingly trivial nature of the trigger made the tragedy even more difficult to process. What discussions did the case prompt? The case drew significant media attention due to the unusual trigger for the shooting. The adult channel subscription became the focal point of coverage, though mental health professionals noted it was likely a symptom of deeper marital issues rather than the true cause. Discussions emerged about how relationship neglect and feeling unheard can build to breaking points, particularly in older adults who may have fewer options for escaping unhappy marriages. Hill's sense of being repeatedly disrespected may have accumulated over time until it overwhelmed her coping mechanisms. The case also highlighted how domestic triggers and mental health crises can lead to violence even in people with no history of criminal behavior or aggression. Hill's 69 years without legal trouble suggested the shooting represented an aberration rather than a pattern. As of 2026, Hill's status remains unclear in public records. She may have been granted parole after serving her minimum time, or she may still be incarcerated serving the remainder of her sentence. The lack of public updates suggests a quiet resolution either way. The tragedy destroyed 2 lives. Frank's was ended, and Patricia's remaining years are marked by imprisonment or the stigma of conviction. The adult channel that triggered the confrontation proved to be a deadly point of contention in a marriage already under strain. While Hill's trigger was a subscription service, another case would involve a far more personal betrayal. Tabitha Pebler. On May 31, 2023, Tabitha Pebler shot and ended the life of her son Brandon Crisco in Fulton County, Arkansas, following an argument that began over a stuck lawnmower. The 44-year-old mother faced charges after what prosecutors described as an escalating domestic dispute that turned deadly. Born around 1980, Pebler had limited background information available in public records. She lived in rural Fulton County in northern Arkansas with family members including her adult son, Brandon. What started the confrontation? The incident began when Pebler asked Brandon for help with a lawnmower that had become stuck. After he helped free it, The mower became stuck again shortly afterward, creating frustration for both parties. When the second stuck occurrence happened, Brandon shoved his mother and used profanity toward her. This physical contact and verbal confrontation represented a significant escalation in the dispute over the lawn equipment. Rather than continuing the argument on the spot, Pebbler walked approximately 250 yards to her vehicle. The distance she traveled and the time it took suggested a cooling-off period, rather than an immediate heat-of-the-moment reaction. What happened next? Pebbler retrieved a pistol from her car and returned to where Brandon remained. The decision to arm herself and return to the scene indicated a deliberate choice rather than an impulsive grab for a nearby weapon. She initially fired warning shots, apparently trying to intimidate or threaten Brandon. These shots did not strike him, but demonstrated she was willing to discharge the firearm. Pebbler then shot Brandon in the chest at close range, inflicting a fatal wound. Medical examination would later confirm the chest gunshot as the cause of his passing. What did she say about her intent? During confession to law enforcement, Pebbler stated she had only intended to scare her son, not to end his life. She claimed the fatal shot was meant as a frightening gesture rather than a lethal attack. This assertion of intent to scare rather than harm became central to how prosecutors and defense attorneys characterized the crime. The warning shots supported her claim about trying to intimidate, though the fatal chest shot contradicted the idea of merely scaring someone. The confession provided investigators with Pebbler's account of events, which largely matched physical evidence from the scene. Her cooperation with the investigation after the shooting suggested some level of remorse or shock at what had occurred. What were the charges and plea? Pebbler was initially charged with second-degree ending, reflecting the belief that while she intentionally fired the fatal shot, the crime lacked the premeditation required for first-degree charges. Rather than proceed to trial, Pebbler entered a guilty plea to manslaughter in July 2024. The reduced charge acknowledged that the shooting occurred during a heated confrontation, rather than as a planned attack. The court sentenced Pebbler to 36 months in prison for the manslaughter conviction. The relatively brief sentence compared to other ending cases reflected the manslaughter classification and possibly consideration of the circumstances leading to the confrontation. What does this case reveal about domestic situations? The escalation from a stuck lawnmower to a fatal shooting demonstrated how quickly routine frustrations can spiral into tragedy when weapons are accessible. The ordinary nature of the initial dispute made the deadly outcome particularly shocking. Brandon's physical contact with his mother represented crossing a line that apparently triggered her decision to arm herself. The family dynamics that allowed such confrontations to occur remained largely unexplored in public proceedings. Pebbler's decision to walk 250 yards to retrieve a weapon, rather than removing herself from the situation entirely, showed poor judgment that ultimately cost her son his life and her own freedom. Alternative choices at that moment could have prevented the tragedy. The warning shots before the fatal one suggested Pebbler was escalating deliberately rather than acting in pure panic. This pattern of increasing threat contradicted claims that she only meant to scare him. As of 2026, Pebbler is likely either still serving or has recently completed her 36-month sentence in the Arkansas Department of Corrections. The 3-year term means she would be approaching or have reached her release date. Upon release, Pebbler will carry the burden of having ended her son's life over an argument about yard work. The relationship between mother and son was permanently destroyed by a confrontation that spiraled beyond any reasonable response. While this involved a family dispute, the final case would demonstrate the darkest form of premeditated crime. Amber Dawn Waterman. In October 2022, Amber Dawn Waterman orchestrated one of Arkansas's most disturbing crimes, kidnapping and ending the life of a pregnant woman to claim her unborn child. Waterman, 43 years old, used a fake Facebook account to lure Ashley Bush from Maysville, Arkansas, under the pretense of offering her a job. Born in 1981, Waterman lived in Pineville, Missouri, just across the border from Arkansas. Limited details about her childhood and background are available in public records. but her actions revealed a disturbing mindset and capacity for deception. How did she target Ashley Bush? Waterman created a fraudulent Facebook profile to establish contact with Bush, who was 33 weeks pregnant at the time. The fake account allowed Waterman to build trust with Bush while concealing her true identity and intentions. Through the Facebook interactions, Waterman offered Bush a job opportunity, providing a seemingly legitimate reason for Bush to meet with her. The promise of employment was particularly appealing to a pregnant woman likely concerned about financial stability for her coming child. Bush agreed to meet Waterman, unaware of the deadly trap being set. She left her Maysville home expecting a job interview, not knowing she would never return. What happened after the kidnapping? Waterman transported Bush from Arkansas to her home in Pineville, Missouri, crossing state lines with her captive. This interstate element would later make the case eligible for federal prosecution, in addition to state charges. Once at her Missouri residence, Waterman ended Bush's life. Forensic evidence revealed gunshot wounds as the method, though the full details of the attack were not released publicly. After ending Bush's life, Waterman attempted to extract the unborn baby, who was named Valkyrie Grace Willis. This horrific act represented Waterman's true motive. She wanted to claim the child as her own. The extraction attempt was unsuccessful in saving the baby, who also passed away. Both Ashley Bush and her unborn daughter Valkyrie became victims of Waterman's scheme to obtain a child through the most violent means imaginable. Waterman attempted to destroy evidence by burning Bush's body, though this effort failed to prevent her eventual identification and the recovery of forensic evidence. How was Waterman caught? When Bush disappeared, her family reported her missing and provided information about the job offer she had mentioned. Investigators traced the Facebook account to Waterman, unraveling the deception she had used to lure Bush. Law enforcement discovered the fraudulent nature of the job offer and Facebook profile, establishing that Waterman had created the elaborate ruse specifically to kidnap a pregnant woman. This premeditation demonstrated the calculated nature of her crimes. Waterman's desire for a child served as the motive for the kidnapping and dual ending. Rather than pursuing legal adoption or fertility treatments, she chose to end lives and attempt to steal an unborn baby. What were the federal charges? Waterman faced federal prosecution for kidnapping resulting in death and causing the death of an unborn child. These federal charges carried the potential for execution or life imprisonment without parole. In July 2024, Waterman entered guilty pleas to both federal charges, accepting responsibility for her actions rather than proceeding to trial. The guilty pleas meant she would avoid a trial but faced severe sentencing. In October 2024, federal court sentenced Waterman to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. The consecutive nature ensured she would never be released from federal custody. What about state charges in Arkansas? Separately from the federal case, Arkansas charged Waterman with 2 counts of capital ending for the deaths of both Ashley Bush and Valkyrie. The state sought the death penalty for these crimes. A mental competency evaluation was conducted to determine if Waterman was fit to stand trial in Arkansas. In September 2025, she was deemed competent to proceed with the state prosecution. The Arkansas State Capital murder trial for Amber Dawn Waterman is currently scheduled to begin in early 2026. However, as she is already serving consecutive life sentences in federal prison, the state proceedings are largely focused on the potential for a death penalty verdict. What is her current status? Waterman is currently held in Benton County Jail awaiting the Arkansas trial, despite already being sentenced to life without parole in federal prison. The state proceedings will run separately from the federal punishment she is already serving. Arkansas prosecutors are actively seeking the death penalty for the dual ending, making the upcoming trial a capital case. If convicted and sentenced to execution, she would join death row even though she cannot be released from federal custody. No public statements or quotes from Waterman have been reported in available media coverage. she has remained largely silent about her motivations and mental state during the crimes. The case represents one of the most premeditated and cold-blooded crimes in Arkansas history. The elaborate Facebook deception, the targeting of a pregnant woman specifically, and the attempt to claim the unborn child all demonstrated careful planning rather than impulsive action. Ashley Bush's family was left to grieve not only her loss, but also the loss of baby Valkyrie, who never had a chance at life. The dual tragedy compounded their suffering and the community's horror at the crimes. Waterman's crimes stand as among the most disturbing in Arkansas criminal history, combining kidnapping, ending of life, and attempted child theft into a single horrific episode. Her life sentences ensure she will never harm anyone else, though the damage she caused to Bush's family and community cannot be undone. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video